is an imaginary terminus set in 1908 on a small branch off of the West London Railway. So the West London was a linking railway run jointly, so it enables us to use locomotives and stock from a wide range of companies.
We try and get everything that you can see to look right, so that you imagine you're standing on a nearby piece of high ground, and it's what you would see if you're looking at the real thing.
It's a completely different world to the one we have now. For instance, the average working day was 12 hours long. Paid holidays were only just beginning to come in, so workers could expect to maybe have a few days paid holiday a year. So the transition between the time when people didn't travel very far and when there was a lot of excursion traffic beginning, because people could go away for a few days at least.
At that time, London was nowhere near as busy as it is now in terms of being developed. And you look at the maps of around that time, you'll find that a lot of the housing was only just being built. It was more like a bunch of towns close together than one homogeneous city.
The railways were the major means of transport. In many ways, cutting-edge technology. It's easy to forget that now, looking at a steam locomotive, which is a fairly simple device. You're talking of an era when the railway train was the fastest means of transport.
You'll have all the industry round about. There is an engineering company here. You can see that the building's fairly new. The same with the station. Wouldn't have been built very many years ago, so it's all quite new.
The buildings, particularly the station buildings, were erected by the railway companies as a statement of who they were and how powerful they were. The station master, for instance, was an important member of any community. They had social standing.
The Victorians used a lot of cast iron. It was a very suitable material at the time. And with cast iron, you tend to make it more ornate. The Victorians liked to have things ornate to show how grand it was and how affluent they were, and that was all part of it. And they had all the canopies to keep the passengers dry, to make it a pleasurable experience for them. The slightly better off families would hire a saloon, a complete coach just to themselves. Their saloon carriage and probably their own personal carriage would be attached to the same train, and they bring the whole lot, and they bring a few servants with them as well, because even the middle classes had servants then. And that sort of set of the carriage and the coach and the horse box, they moved the whole lot and attach it to another train to go on down to the south coast, for instance.
At that time there were 3 classes, first, second and third class. Some of the third class were simple wooden seats with no cushions at all. The second class would be a little more opulent with some padding, but the first class would be extremely comfortable.
In those days, it was fairly expensive, especially if you're travelling first class, but then those are the people who could afford it and probably quite like to show off. Third class, you could probably go for 6p or 8p for a few miles. You could go short distances. They also ran excursions, so when the factories in the early part of the 20th century, when they closed down for a whole week and actually gave somebody a holiday, they would have a whole train laid on specially, and the whole town virtually would go to the coast.
Railways at the time were general carriers, and on Clarendon we have a very large goods shed, and the justification for that is that this is an interchange point between several railway companies. Whatever you presented to the goods depot, the railway had to carry, so they had to provide wagons to cope with all sorts of traffic. The system was amazingly sophisticated. It was quite possible for a shopkeeper in London to order something from Glasgow and receive it the next morning. It would be quite likely that a parcel would be manhandled several times on its journey. So it would be put on in a wagon at the local station, taken up to the junction, put in something else to go on to the next stage, and when it arrives here at Clarendon it can be shipped from one company to the other. So a parcel from the Midlands may come down on the North Western Railway and be transshipped in that shed onto a wagon going down to Brighton. We've been working on it getting on for 14 years. The group has varied in size over the years. There's between 10 and 15 of us. We meet at least once a week, 3 or 4 hours. I don't know about the arithmetic of that, but it's far too many hours. Well, I'm trying to finish a locomotive I started several years ago, which is a London North Western 440 four-cylinder compound. This is the loco itself. It's in works grey at the moment. Railway enthusiasts will know all about that. The railway companies tended to paint stuff grey first. The chassis is made of nickel silver. The wheels are sprung. The motor, Mashima motor, sitting on a 108:1 ratio gearbox to give nice, steady, controlled, slow running. Far more important on our layout than high speed. We want to be able to back the loco, for instance, onto a train and just watch those buffers crush up without moving the train. When that happens, it's really satisfying. It's both for us and the onlooker.
To get smooth running, we've found that you need a fair amount of weight inside the vehicle. It's interesting that visually you can tell if something's actually heavy when it's moving along, the way they move, the way they sat on the track. With these early locomotives, of course, they're quite small, and by the time you've got a reasonable mechanism inside, there's not a lot of space left for the weight. The wheels on these locomotives are all sprung, so they do follow the slight irregularities in track much better, so you've got a better chance of picking up the current and not having a break.
We thought it was nearly finished, and then somebody came up with the idea of an extension. I think basically what's happened is when we started we had a layout but not a lot of stock, and now we have an awful lot of stock and not enough layout. So people, having spent untold hours building rakes of coaches, don't want to see them left in the box.
Right, so what we're doing here is we're making standard lengths of track for the proposed extension. Take some sleepers, there's 2 types, there's a narrow one and a slightly wider one, and then the wider sleepers go at each end of the track, and then the rest are the standard size of sleepers. These sleepers are then put into the template. Once you've got the whole template filled with sleepers, you then place the rails over the ends, moving the chairs obviously to align with the sleeper. In the age and the period that we're modelling, there were 2 types of chair in common use. One was a 3-bolt fixing and the other is a 4-bolt. And in this particular example you will see this is a 4-bolt fixing. That's what P4 modelling is all about, absolutely true to scale in all respects. We then glue the chairs onto the sleeper on the one side only, then make sure that we've got the gauge right, put 2 or 3 of these on the length that we want. That obviously keeps the gauge of the track in the correct position, and then we finally glue the other sleeper on the other rail into place. At the end of that, we've then got one track section.
We're sometimes criticised by people watching the layout for running too slowly. They're basically relying on their memories of the 50s and 60s, when locomotives, were a bit run down, but they were fairly modern and had good brakes, whereas in these days, most of the locos we model have got wooden brake blocks, usually made of a wood like poplar that doesn't burn easily, trying to stop the train. The brakes in those days were pretty pathetic by modern standards. So when our station pilot moves out a heavy train of empty stock off to the carriage sidings, of course it's going to go slowly, because they haven't got all the brakes of the train to rely on. You may have the guard in the guard's compartment with a brake as well, but that was it. So it had to be slow.
Also, the pace of life was very much slower then than it is now. The railways were at the time the fastest thing around, although it seems slow to us now. It was an awful lot faster than what had gone before. back to building some open wagons, because we normally build vans, but in 1908, 1910, there were far more open wagons, merchandise, things like these, than anything else. And it's much easier to batch build things. So there's about 8 wagon bodies there already. And before I assembled them, I put the ends on the vertical drill and drilled through all the shanks. Ready for the spring buffers to go in. These got a coil spring inside the shank. Now I'm making up the underframe in brass. The idea is that these will be sprung wheels. See all 4 wheels are sprung by a very fine piece of wire. That's all it is that holds them up. There's one there, ready for cutting up. I think we've all found it very educational and fascinating building this railway, because you end up learning about the sociology of the time as well.
The interesting thing has been researching into how the railways operated. The last 60 years prior to this, you went from a society where people probably never went any further than they could walk in a day to quite a lot of mobility. The train was the means of transport.